Good morning. So today, moving on from the Igeres Haramban, we're going to go right down to modern contemporary times, and we are going to look at how the very same themes, to some extent, have lingered, and we're going to look at their treatment of it. I'll explain to you what I mean. Because we're learning specifically at the moment about the Yesod HaShlishi, which is Incorporeality of Hashem, we're going to look at how this topic has reared its head again, and we're going to look specifically at two people and certainly one book. And again, I want to state at the outset that the purpose of this is not muck-raking, as we say in English. It's not to be dogmatic, or maybe that's the wrong word. You know, the joke is that there is the dogma of dogmalessness Judaism. You know, with Mendelssohn, that was the joke. Yeah. The dogmalessness is also a dogma. But leaving that aside, you might think that the topic, which was the cause of, or at least a good portion, a good chelek of what caused the controversy in the early 13th century, was Hashem's corporeality versus his incorporeality, as we saw in the Igeres Haramban, etc. You would have thought that by now it's sort of quietened down and it's no longer an issue. Apparently not. And there's a fellow who you may or may not have heard of, Rabbi Nathan Slifkin, who was somewhat controversial. And he wrote an article, which I have here, on his blog. This was published, I think, in Shapiro. You don't have it there. You don't have it there. I'll come to your bundle shortly. I'll come to your... Yeah, his blog is called Rationalist Judaism. I'm not going to comment on him or his blog, or there's been enough said about that. But he wrote an article in a publication in 2009 called the publication is called Shapiro, and the title of the article is "Was Rashi a Corporealist?" by Nathan Slifkin, Views of God in Medieval France. Okay, it's a longish article, and although he put it in he phrased it. The title is a question: Was Rashi a corporealist? Which is actually rather smart to pose a question. But he certainly entertains the notion. Let's leave it at that. You can read it. I'll put the link to it on I'll attach it to the video, and you can go and look at it yourself. But he raises the question that potentially Rashi may have been a corporealist. Okay. This elicited
Meaning he doesn't pose this question under the agenda to say that Rashi was definitely a corporealist. I didn't read it.
He seems... Conclusion. You know what? I'll read his conclusion. I'll read it in his own words. We began by noting that the commonly advanced arguments that Rashi advocated a corporealist understanding of God have little or no validity. Again, right. Okay, the double negative. But we then noted that the arguments supporting the opposite position, in fact, have the reverse effect. It is clearly of utmost importance to Rashi to tell his readers when Scripture is speaking allegorically vis-à-vis God's power. However, he does not do so with all the mentions of God's physical form, including those that he himself initiates. Given the time and place in which he lived, Rashi could not have possibly taken for granted that his readers would automatically understand these as non-literal. We further brought a diverse range of arguments showing that Rashi maintained a corporeal view of God. Someone who is a priori opposed to the idea that Rashi was corporealist will devise rejoinders to all these arguments. But with the testimony of Ramban and other Rishonim that there were many great Torah scholars in France who were corporealists, one cannot dismiss the fact that one of those scholars could easily have been Rashi. His view of God appears to accord with that described by the Rabbi Zaya Ditrani, as held by many Torah scholars, including some of the sages of the Talmud, that God is of gigantic human form, but made of an ethereal substance and not subject to human frailties or limitations. Note that this may mean that Rashi was a more extreme corporealist than Rabbi Moshe Taku, who only took the view that God can assume human form whenever he wishes. We have seen no evidence of Rashi believing that it is only when God so desires that he assumes human form. This essay should not be misunderstood. I do not believe it is acceptable for a person to believe in a corporeal God. In a future essay, I hope to explain why, even if Rashi maintained this view, it can still be rated as heretical to believe it today. Rashi said it, but we cannot. And on those somewhat enigmatic words, he finishes his essay. I will not comment. Those are his own words, okay? This elicited a response from...
Do we have it?
Pardon?
Do we have it?
No. I'm going to keep you to the... Again, I will attach these, and you can read them at your own leisure, okay? By a fellow called Saul Zucker, and he wrote an article in the same publication, Hakira, in 2010, and he entitled it, "No, Rashi was not a corporealist." Again, it's a long article, and he's got a bunch of premises, and I'll just read a little portion. In his article, Was Rashi a Corporealist?, Rabbi Nathan Slifkin presented what he purports to be a powerful case that Rashi was a corporealist. He posted the article on his website, inviting comments and critique. The ensuing discussion on the website provides an expanded and clarified views of Rabbi Slifkin's position as delineated in his article, and is thus a valuable resource to fully understand his argument. In the course of this article, I shall make reference both to Slifkin's article and to posts on his website in order to examine his claims. An analysis of Slifkin's article shows that his entire argument, including the 5 principal subdivisions of evidence that Rashi's corporealism rests on 4 basic premises. They are as follows. Number 1, it was prevalent among Torah scholars of northern France during the time of Rashi. Number 2, from the fact that Rashi takes pains to stress, in certain instances, the glaring omission in others leads to the conclusion that he interpreted such anthropomorphisms literally. Number 3, Rashi's euphemisms about certain biblical anthropomorphisms regarding Hashem's covering Moshe with his hand and his carrying Israel on the wings of vultures implies that the truth lies in a literal understanding of the biblical verse. Number 4, Rashi's comments about various Talmudic anthropomorphisms imply that he understood them literally. And then he takes each of them one by one and proceeds to, in his view, to demolish them. Okay? That's his response. Mm-hmm. We then have, again, I'm just showing you, we then have Slifkin responded to Saul Zucker, and then Saul wrote another 35-paged response, a critique of Rabbi Slifkin's response. Again, it's here. We're not going to go through it, but I just wanted to point that out, and again, I will link them to them, and if you want to go and read them, you can go and read them. There are a couple of other interesting articles, but now that was Slifkin. We'll leave that for a moment, and we will go somewhere else. We will go to Mark Shapiro's book, right? We'll go to Mark Shapiro's book.
Sorry, may I just ask?
Yes.
So what would you like us to realize?
I would like you to realize that the debate is, at least according to...
None of them is positing that it's a possibility nowadays for us to entertain this notion for Yidden today, right?
But the idea they were entertaining the notion that Rashi
could have been...
That Rashi could... There is this scholarly so-called debate, right. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but that whether it was focusing primarily on Rashi. Now, Rashi is a big deal. The fact that in 2010, 2012, as it was then, that there can be a debate, there seems to be a debate. Again, we have to, at some point, we're going to have to put into the mix the quality of the sources, the credentials, if you like, of the protagonists. And I'm going to come back to that. You ask a very good point. All I've done is, I've shown you that there are these 2 people who I know neither of them personally, who are debating whether Rashi was or was not a corporate realist. That's all I'm doing. And in fact, the cheshbon for not going into it in detail because I don't want to give it too much credibility. But I just want to show you that it's there. Okay? We're now going to move on to stuff that we will go into. Hey, no cheating. and now we come to Mark Shapiro's book. Mark Shapiro's book is called The Limits. It's published in 2004. The Limits of Orthodox Theology. Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised. Now, this elicited, his book elicited quite a bit of critique, especially certainly in the more right-wing and the more Haredi circles. I'm also going to put for you on the link here, so for example, in Torah Umada journal, yeah, hello, you with me?
Yeah.
I'm going to let me take you through it. The point is to try and give you the pathway of where I'm trying to take you. Sure. On his book, The Limits of Orthodox Theology. So, for example, Yitzchak Blau in Torah Umada Journal in 2004 published a critique of which we're actually going to read one page. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then we're going to zero in on his treatment of specifically what we are learning, which is the third principle, Hashem's incorporeality. Okay? There's a fellow called Rabbi Herschel Grossman who wrote a strong critique of Mark Shapiro's book generally, and I've printed out for you, specifically focusing just on this third principle. Mm-hmm. Okay? Mark Shapiro responded, just follow for the moment, just follow with me, it'll be easier. That's why I'm trying to give you, when we need to refer to it, I'll take you to it, please. It'll be easier for you. So, Mark Shapiro wrote this book. This elicited critique responses, even within sort of his own world, so to speak. David Berger, Yitzchak Blau, etc. All of this will be linked to you. Then on more on the right wing, for want of a better term, there was in the journal Dialogue. There was quite a long and detailed article, very critical of Mark Shapiro's approach and book in many respects, to which he responded, to this Herschel Grossman, to which Grossman responded back, again, a lengthy response. And we're going to focus primarily on one aspect of it, which is his treatment of this incorporeality thing, because this is what we're dealing with, to get a sense of the Rishonim and what was going on. And then Rabbaran Lopiansky wrote an article in which we will go through, also addressing the idea of incorporeality, and we're going to read also Reb Zev Leff's review of Mark Shapiro's book. Okay, and that's what we're going to go through. Okay, so this is sort of kind of what we're going to go through. We're going to start in no particular order. I'm going to start sort of more. We'll try and get through all of this in today if we can. I don't know. So start off with the single sheet in your bundle. There's a single sheet which is. There's a single sheet, okay? This is part of Yitzchak Blau's review of Mark Shapiro's book, and it's on page 187 on the top. It says...
Listen to who's Mr. Blau?
Rabbi Blau is a rabbi. He's written on a bunch of different things.
I know the Blau family is big.
I don't think it's... Let's take it at its... Let's just read what he's got to say for the moment, okay? Furthermore, let's start here from furthermore, on page 187, yeah? Furthermore, the impressive list of sources compiled by Shapiro includes figures whose authoritative status is unclear. And this is a really, really strong and important point. I think I've mentioned to you already. Not everybody that lived in the 1230s, just because they lived there and had a beard, doesn't make them a Rishon. Like in any other discipline, and this is something we need to be very conscious of in terms of Masorah. And then the finding of Kisvei Yad and ascribing a gravity, a gravitas, a weighting to an opinion. You know, if I were today to opine on a subject, and argue with Reb Moshe Feinstein Zatzal, then it would quite frankly be a joke. Even though I've learnt a little bit, and I have a beard, yes, just about. And the barber didn't manage to cut it off when I fell asleep in the chair last week, all of it. And it is the same in history, in Lahavdil, in geography, in science. And like we've mentioned, the system of peer review and critique to which Torah's writings are subject to is beyond compare. There's nothing like it. And this is the point he's making. Just because Shapiro can unearth a manuscript of some sort which says, Rabbi David ben so-and-so in 1233 in wherever wrote this, very nice. Who was he? What is he? So we need to, it's not just purely mathematical, yes? That's the point that he's making. And it's a very valid point. Let's have a look. It's just one argument. Furthermore, the impressive list of sources compiled by Shapiro includes figures whose authoritative status is unclear. Here, his erudition may get in the way of the argument. I love the English. Yes? Mm-hmm. Among others, Shapiro cites Reb Shem Tov Gagin, Reb Shneir Zalman Dov Anushevsky, Reb Yitzchak Lopez, and Reb Yitzchak Pilitz. These writers may have been great sages, but this reader failed to recognize any of the names and wondered whether or not much weight should be given to these positions. In the case of Rabbi Anushevsky, Shapiro cites a long list of haskamas that appears before one of his works, yet we would certainly not bestow canonical status on many contemporary volumes that boast significant approbations. Just the fact that you have haskamas means, okay, you have haskamas, fine. Shapiro needs to do more work to convince us of the significance of the more peripheral voices. Finally, Shapiro makes a mistake or two and includes some questionable readings. You can leave this one out. And turn over the page. Sort of 4 or 5 lines down. Shapiro cites the author of Tiferet Yisrael as possibly believing in an anthropomorphic God, when Tiferet Yisrael is quite explicit elsewhere that God lacks physicality. So there is, he questions some of the validity of some of his claims. The Tiferet Yisrael we have on the Mishnah, Rav Lipschitz. Okay. And you've got the sources there. Again, I will give you the full article. I will give to you. Now let's move on. Yeah. Now let's move on to some of the more meaty stuff, and we are going to look at the thing. You know what? Let's actually go do it and drop backwards, because I think that will be interesting. Let's look at Rav Lef's review. This was published in Jewish Action in 2007. Summer 2007. Now, Jewish Action, just in case you're not familiar with it, is the OU's magazine. Yeah? So, you can see it online. A lot of it's available online. Let's have a look. Let's read it through it. Let's read through it. It's not all that long. It's a few pages, but it's now he's actually reviewing 2 Sfarim. One's a book, one's a sefer, whatever. The other one I actually have. It took me a bit to get it, and that is Reb Yochanan Bechhofer's sefer on. It's called Evan Shasia on the. It's in Hebrew on the Yud Gimel Midas. I have it here. I managed to get hold of it. It wasn't all that easy to get hold of. And he was a Talmid of. In fact, I've quoted from it a couple of times in these series of shiurim. Mm-hmm. He was a Talmid of.
He's still alive? Yeah.
Yes, a Talmid of Rav Yaakov Weinberg, and he took a lot of his commentary from tapes, a series of tapes that the Feldheim published, a very small Chaval. It doesn't do Rav Yaakov Weinberg justice. They published it. You can get it. Feldheim. It's called Ani Mamin, I think. It's a sort of more like a pamphlet. It's about 60, 70 pages. This takes it much, much deeper. You know, the comment I made to you about believing that Hashem is spiritual is equally heretical to believing that he's physical. That comes from those. There's depth there, and there's real. There's a lot of great stuff. So
he has a website called Evan Shasia.
I believe yes, correct. Oh, yeah, quite right. Very good. Yeah, right. Although I've got the wrong glasses, so let's read through this. Says Rav Lev, although the limits of Orthodox theology and the Evan Shasia are both dedicated to discussing Rambam's 13 principles of faith, as formulated in his commentary, they do so from very different perspectives. Rabbi Bechhofer presents scholarly, halachic, and hashkafic explanations for each principle, which are largely based on the insights of his mentor, Rosh Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg, the late Rosh Hashiva of Ner Yisrael. The author is mainly concerned with demonstrating the role the 13 principles play in Jewish theology. Since the entire Torah was dictated by God, one would think that everything in the Torah is of equal significance. Nevertheless, Rambam held that there is room for defining principles of faith. The Chasam Sofer, in his responsa, cites a source even earlier than the Rambam who refers to 13 principles of faith, albeit the source does not identify exactly what they are. Rabbi Bechhofer cites Rabbi Weinberg's opinion that the 13 principles do not define the Jewish religion. That purpose would be served by the 3 basic principles, as the Rav Yosef Albo says in Sefer Ikrim: belief in God, belief in divine source of Torah, and the concept of reward and punishment. The 13 principles that Rambam sets forth point to why the Torah is the absolute truth. Additionally, they define the Jewish people and what creates the faith community, right? As we saw in the Rambam Pirush Mishnayos. In other words, the principles define who is within the faith community in Klal Yisrael and who, by virtue of not accepting some of them, is outside of this community. Rabbi Bechhofer proceeds to examine each of the 13 principles. His stated purpose in writing this exposition is, quote, to explain in a comprehensive manner how these principles are one system and each principle is a necessary component to accepting the Torah as such, unquote. He also explains that each of these principles is based on tradition and revelation rather than on philosophical investigation. Rabbi Bechhofer therefore limits his discussion of these principles to sources that are within the Torah tradition. Dr. Shapiro also examines each of the 13 principles in a comprehensive and scholarly manner. He informs us that his work was written in response to an article by Rabbi Yehuda Parnas that appeared in Yeshiva University's Torah Umada journal. In the article, Rabbi Parnas argues that heresy is defined by the 13 principles of Maimonides. Dr. Shapiro acknowledges that the underlying assumption that the 13 principles are the bedrock of orthodoxy has never been openly challenged in modern times by those who identify with orthodoxy. Nevertheless, Dr. Shapiro wrote an article, which was published in that journal, and which subsequently served as the basis for the expanded work in response to Rabbi Parnas, with the purpose of showing that, quote, traditional Jewish theology has allowed for much more latitude. There's more scope to latitude than is found in the 13 principles.
Spielraum.
Was?
In this context, Spielraum.
Spielraum. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As a result, many outstanding sages did not regard the 13 principles as the last word in Jewish theology. Indeed, there is a history of opposition to Maimonides' principles among the rank of traditional, or, as it is called in modern times, Orthodox Judaism. Similarly, in concluding the book, Dr. Shapiro writes, quote, I wrote this book to examine the claim that Maimonides' principles are the last word in Jewish theology. Simply by looking at traditional Jewish sources, I believe it has been clearly demonstrated that many of his principles were not regarded as authoritative either before his time or afterwards. The fact that Maimonides placed the stamp of apostasy on anyone who disagreed with his principles did not frighten away numerous great sages from their search for truth. The lesson for moderns is clear. Unquote. Says Rabbi Leff, after reading Dr. Shapiro's work, I am not convinced that he clearly demonstrated anything more than the fact that in regard to the 13 principles in all areas of Torah, differences of opinion have always existed. This is the manner in which Torah sages who are entrusted with the transmission of the oral law develop and decide that law. Nevertheless, this does not preclude a consensus emerging subsequent to the conflicts of opinion. That is to say, even though there were differences of opinion concerning the 13 principles in the Middle Ages, today the principles are universally accepted. Dr. Shapiro argues that, quote, since the sources of Jewish theology are not part of the curriculum in yeshivot, the students know nothing of them, nor is the typical posek who has mastered the Talmud, codes and responsa, acquainted with the theological literature, and he often does not even recognize the issues, unquote. It should be noted, says Rabbi Leff, that Rabbi Weinberg, who delivered extensive talks on the 13 principles at Ner Yisrael and elsewhere, and Rabbi Bechhofer are both products of yeshivot. Serious Talmud students study Musa, Emunah, Chumash, Tanakh, Tefillah, as well as other so-called theological literature, despite the fact that these subjects are not part of the official yeshiva curriculum. These students approach each subject from the classical Jewish sources, and they are capable of doing so because they have an extensive and deep understanding of both the oral and written law. Is Dr. Shapiro unaware of the Musar and Hashkafa Vadim that take place in every yeshiva? Is he unacquainted with the abundance of Sfarim published every year on a variety of topics related to theology, written by famous Rosh Yeshiva, as well as by serious young Talmudic scholars, both in Israel and in the diaspora? Our scholars are very aware of Jewish theology. Nevertheless, they arrived at a consensus that Rambam's principles should be accepted. Every serious yeshiva student knows that there were disagreements as to whether the 13 principles were, in fact, beneficial to posit, and if so, which ones were considered principles. Is there a serious yeshiva student who is ignorant of Rabbi Yosef Albo Sefer Ikrim or Rabbi Moshe Ditrani's Beit Elokim? Yes, there were disagreements as to what kind of disbelief rendered one a heretic, e.g., open rebellion, erroneous intellectual conclusions, or ignorance. Yet while there were disagreements with regard to the various details and the parameters of the principles, the 13 principles have been accepted in their general form as the expression of Torah Judaism. And as stated above, one who denies any of them is outside of the pale of the faith community of Torah Judaism. For example, the conviction that God is a corporeal being, like any other corporeal being, is a belief that is outside the realm of Judaism, despite the fact that the sages do not agree whether to deem one a heretic for harboring this belief. Hence, the principle is true, although its exact parameters are subject to the debate of Torah scholars. This situation is comparable to that which occurs with the publication of the Shulchan Aruch. Despite the fact that there were debate amongst bona fide Torah scholars as to the benefit and propriety of creating a code of Jewish law, and despite the fact that there are instances where the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch have not been accepted, the Shulchan Aruch overall has been accepted by Klal Yisrael, its sages, and the rank and file of observant Jews, and has therefore become the definitive code of Jewish observance. Similarly, over the generations, the 13 principles have been accepted as the definitive code of Jewish belief, albeit not every detail of Rambam's presentation of them has been accepted. Hence, Yigdal and the 13 principles are recited by most Jews every day in Shachris. Dr. Shapiro admits that he is not a theologian, but rather an intellectual historian. Indeed, perhaps this explains why he misunderstands so many Torah sources. Ouch. While one of the 13 principles, the ouch is me, not Rabbi Leff. While one of the 13 principles is that the entire Torah that was handed to Moshe Rabbeinu is God-given, Dr. Shapiro tries to show that how certain parts of the Torah are post-Mosaic. And I don't want to go into this, guys, at the moment, because we're going to have a lot of fun when we get to it, eventually, probably in about 3 years' time at this rate. But there's a lot of stuff to do on that. Okay, but we'll read it. We're doing this anyway. We'll read it. He states, quote from Dr. Shapiro, in his commentary on Numbers 22:1, Rashbam focuses on the phrase beyond the Jordan. The difficulty is that in Moses' day, the Israelites had not yet entered the Promised Land, and the term beyond the Jordan would not have been used for the side of the Jordan on which they were encamped. Dr. Shapiro concludes, in other words, this phrase was only added after Moses' death, which occurred before the Israelites crossed the Jordan. This explanation is a far cry from that of Rashbam, who does not even where's it gone? I've lost my... Who does not even...
78 about intimate? Yeah, intimate.
1 minute, what's going on over here? Sorry. Intimate. Sorry. Who does not even intimate when this section was written. Rather, Rashbam simply explains that beyond the Jordan was... Okay, I'm not going to...
Expression. What does it mean? He didn't even intimate.
Intimate. He didn't hint to. We're actually going to.
Hinting. Okay. So anyway.
We're actually not going to go into these. Come back to this and revisit this when we get to the specifics. Okay.
Well, he debunks a bunch of examples.
Yeah, that's basically what we are seeing. Agoda, halacha. Let's move forward because I want to try and stick to the point that we are doing here. Go to page, and this is interesting. Page 79. Dr. Shapiro, it's about half the way down the first column. Dr. Shapiro subsequently goes on to make a brazen attack on Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Alleging that Rav Moshe was unaware of Maimonides' philosophical views, Dr. Shapiro states, although Rav Moshe Feinstein was the greatest posek of his time, he seems to have had no knowledge of Maimonidean philosophy. He was therefore able to state that Maimonides believed in the protective power of holy names and the names of agents. He therefore was able to state that Maimonides believed in the protective power of holy names and the names of angels as used in amulets, kameos. For Maimonides' rejection of this, see his commentary on Mishnah Sota and the Guide. Unquote. Says Rabbi Leff, Dr. Shapiro evidently misunderstood Rav Moshe's responsum, as well as the Rambam, both in his commentary to the Mishnah and his Guide to the Perplexed. Before I explain what Rambam and Rav Moshe actually said, let's assume that the Rambam did in fact dispute the protective power of God's names, as Dr. Shapiro claims. And let's assume that Rav Moshe never learnt the Guide for Perplexed. But is it likely that Rav Moshe was also unaware of the Rambam's commentary to Mishnah? Obviously, Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah is the domain of a halachist and Talmudist, even according to Dr. Shapiro. Perhaps Rav Moshe held that Rambam's words in the Mishnah Torah superseded halachically his words in the commentary, his commentary to the. Sorry, that is perhaps Rav Moshe held that the Rambam's words in Mishnah Torah superseded halachically his words in the commentary to the Mishnah. In the former, Rambam rules that God's name, Shakai, should be placed on the outside of the mezuzah, indicating his belief that the Shem does have protective power. Many times there are conflicts between the Mishnah Torah and the commentary to the Mishnah, and usually the Mishnah Torah is considered the more authoritative. But we do not need to resort to this line of reasoning. Rambam does not dispute the protective power of God's holy names. A simple reading of both sources reveal that Rambam is actually defining what in fact constitutes the name of God. He says that people think that the combinations of letters from verses constitute the names of God that have magical powers. This, says the Rambam, is a view held by fools and amulet writers who use the letter combinations as God's name. In fact, God's name are the descriptive names mentioned in the Torah and codified in the Talmud as the 7 names that one is prohibited to erase. Rambam never disputes their ability to protect. Hence he says that it is customary to write God's name Shakai on the outside of the mezuzah and not on the inside. Similarly, Rambam says that amulets that contain God's name and Torah verses are sacred. In his response to him, Rav Moshe simply quotes the Rambam in Mishnah Torah, where he prohibits the insertion of God's name into a mezuzah, not because he didn't believe in their power, but because doing so would reduce the mezuzah to an amulet and thus diminish its true importance as a divine command. Rambam likewise states that although using Torah verses or divine names to heal is prohibited, using them for protection is permissible. Hence, Rav Moshe was not ignorant of Rambam's philosophical opinions. Let's just read the last 2 paragraphs. Evan Shasia will encourage people to study matters of faith and theology and to delve into them in the same manner they probe other Torah subjects. As with all Torah study, the study of such subjects will be for the purpose of lilmoid almanos la'asos, encouraging observance and commitment to Torah, thus glorifying and magnifying the Torah. I recommend Evan Shasia to Torah students who can appreciate it. A translation in English is soon to be released, which will make it accessible to the wider public. As for the limits of Orthodox theology, I cannot recommend it to the general public, who can be easily misled by some of the questionable theses in this book. For the discerning reader, who will carefully check the sources, this book will provide an interesting historical perspective as to the various opinions surrounding the 13 principles. Very, mic drop. So he has...
No, this is also acknowledging, Slag don't, yeah.
Yeah, the words stand for themselves. That's Rav Leff.
I have a question for the Evan Shasia. It's a quite thin book.
Correct.
How difficult is the Hebrew?
It's not all that easy. It wasn't easy for me to get hold of the book. I had to source it in Yerushalayim.
Really?
It wasn't easy for me to get hold of it. It does not. You won't. At least when I looked for it, I couldn't find it in the
dense and difficult language. Or?
It's not. The language is not all that easy. Let's start. I'm setting the scene a little bit. Let us now get into some of the meat. We're now going to look into Herschel Grossman's his review of Mark Shapiro on what we are learning. Okay, let's have a look. Mm-hmm. The third principle, incorporeality of God. Okay, so again, to be clear, this is Rabbi Herschel Grossman's critique of, as part of a much bigger article, the bit which is relevant to us, okay? The principle affirms that God has no body, nor aspect of a body. Says Shapiro, Although, as we shall see, the Bible and Talmud speak of corporeal God, Maimonides' philosophical outlook forced him to insist on divine Sorry? Yeah? Maimonides' philosophical outlook forced him to insist on divine incorporeality. I mean, just take that sentence. Although, as we shall see, the Bible and Talmud speak of a corporeal God, Maimonides' philosophical outlook forced him to insist on divine incorporeality. Here too, Shapiro is saying that the Rambam's codifications are a contrived formulation based upon his philosophical outlook, but inconsistent with the Bible and the Talmud. So the Bible and the Talmud, Shapiro is stating, the Bible and the Talmud speak of this is a direct quote, the Bible and Talmud speak of a corporeal God. In other words...
Well, they do, but he seems to imply that this is what they mean.
That's what he says. That is exactly what he says. The Bible and Talmud, and this is very telling, speak of a corporeal God, but the Rambam's philosophical outlook forced him, and he uses that word, forced him to do something which essentially is inconsistent with what the Bible and Talmud appear to be telling us. Now, that sentence it reveals a huge amount about Shapiro's mindset and approach to this subject. And Grossman is very smart, is very cleverly picking up on that. Just using his words. Let's keep going. We're only getting started, my friends. Mm-hmm. We're only getting started. He writes that, and here's a quote from Shapiro, "It should be obvious to all that Maimonides' insistence on God's incorporeality contradicts a simple reading of the Bible, and nowhere in the Bible does it state that God is incorporeal or invisible for that matter." Direct quote. Shapiro, now back to Grossman's comment. Shapiro must surely be aware that a belief that God has a body reduces Judaism to a form of idolatry, as the Rambam explicitly writes, yet Shapiro insists that this is an authentic Jewish belief. In other words, Maimonides' insistence, itself an interesting word, on Hashem's incorporeality contradicts simple reading of the Torah, and nowhere in the Torah does it say that God is incorporeal. That means the simple reading is that God has a body, and that is authentic Jewish belief. But the Rambam, forced because of his philosophy, had to go elsewhere. Let's keep going. In his Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the Rambam details the elements necessary to fulfill the mitzvah of belief in the unity of God, which we perform twice daily through the recitation of Shema. And we've done this before. This God is one. He is not two or more, but one unified in a manner which is blah, 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 blah. He can have no body or form. Behold, it is... This is the Rambam. I'm skipping down halfway here because we've done this. Behold, it is explicitly stated in the Torah and the works of the prophets that the Holy One, blessed be He, is not a body or a physical form as it is stated, because the Lord your God is the Lord in the heavens above and the earth below, and a body cannot exist in two places. Also, for you did not see any image, and in Yeshaya it says, to whom can you liken me? With whom can I be equal? Were he to be confined to a body, he would resemble other bodies. So Shapiro, says Grossman, Shapiro says that the Rambam is inconsistent with the Bible and Talmud, even although the Rambam cites specific verses as proofs of his principles. Shapiro's argument is that his own reading of the verses indicates that the very same verses cited by the Rambam as a proof that God has no body are indications that God has a body. For example, the Rambam adduces the verse which says, you have not seen any image, as proof. Shapiro interprets the verse differently. Quote, ye saw no manner or form on the day that the Lord spoke to you. This is not a denial of divine corporeality, only a statement that God's form was not seen. Ki lo re'isem, Shapiro's a London, ki lo re'isem kol tamuna. You didn't see a form. But the fact that you didn't see it doesn't mean that he doesn't. It means you weren't zeicha to see it. But of course he has one, but you weren't zeicha to see it. The very same posuk which the Rambam uses, the very same posuk. And so basically what we have here is a machlokas, Shapiro, and the Rambam pshat in a posuk. It is as simple and as brutal as that. Each using their own words. I'm not extrapolating anything here. I'm being very careful. And if we let's get a chumash because let's get a chumash
On your left.
because on my left.
That's over there.
Oh, something chumashim. No, because the context is don't make an image. Don't make an image. Do you know why? So now you have two. This is the context, right? Ki lo re'isem kol tmuna. One second, please. Just a second. Mm-hmm. Oh, here we go. Oi. Here we go. Moshe Rabbeinu in Perek Dalet is telling Klal Yisrael the importance of handing over to their children all about Matan Torah, and he says that there was the Eish, etc., and he gave you your bris, and Hashem commanded me, V'nishmartem od lenafshei seichem. Be very careful when you go into Eretz Yisrael, because this is a culture, a pagan culture, where they're very much into image representations of divine deities. V'nishmartem od lenafshei seichem, ki lo yrisam kol tmuna. Pentashchisun v'asisem lachem pesel. You might make a tmuna, a tamnis zochon, a keva, behema, tzipor, tamnis koremes, and maybe of the shamayim. No. You must not make any imagery at all. You know why you must not make any imagery at all? Not because it's Avodah Zarah, according to Shapiro, but because you then would be creating something from your imagination. Not because Hashem doesn't have a tmuna. Of course, He may have a tmuna, but you're making it up. The problem is not that it's Avodah Zarah in the sense. The Rambam is the posuk kipshutai. You didn't see a tmuna, meaning there is no tmuna. Don't think you did. You didn't see. They saw with their mind's eye. They saw Hashem, but lo yrisem kol tmuna. So we have basically bottom line. You have a far, if I may say, more.
So sounds.
Me arguing with on something very, very, very important. It's not even on a technical detail of halacha. It's not like me arguing with Rav Moshe Feinstein. With the greatest of respect, Mark Shapiro arguing with the Rambam on a yesod of emunah based on pshat in a posuk. Well, who would you side with? Similarly, Rambam quotes a verse in Yeshaya, "To whom can you compare me and I will be like him?" as a textual source that Jews believe in non-corporeality. Shapiro cites the very same verse as evidence to the contrary. He writes that this verse is not a denial that God has a form, only that this form is unlike anything else. So again, the very same pasuk, the machlokas. In other words, Shapiro has no qualms about saying that the Rambam got his translation wrong. And this, my friends, is where we are heading. Does this ring a bell with anything that Rav Leff wrote? And this is what I'm going to say this even for the camera, I don't care. This is what is treif about the world of academia. To use Rabbi Leff's words, to be brazen. A brazen attack on Rav Moshe Feinstein. Which not only the substance is wrong, but this is really, as we're going to see, we're only getting started. And again, of course, chas v'shalom, this is not ad hominem, this is not personal, but this is a broad thing. When a person who may be scholarly and in the world of academia, but if somebody is able to write on psukim, the Rambam says this is the pshat in the pasuk, but I think the Rambam basically got it wrong. And it's inconsistent with the Bible, and then take it from there to say that it is therefore inconsistent with the Bible and the Talmud. And therefore it must be the Rambam's preconceived philosophical formulations insists him to create a dogma which is inconsistent with a simple reading of the Bible and the Talmud. That approach is not one that we can accept. The approach. Forget the details. You hear that? That's the nakuda. Yeah. And we will be seeing this nakuda again and again and again. It then leads, this arrogance, it must be said, this hubris, leads to mistakes. It leads to not just mistakes, more than mistakes. and we will see more. We'll have to go now, but we will see more details of this. But it's the approach which really is the problem more than anything else. To be continued.